So, gay people like myself have this expression called spilling the tea, and while I don't have any tea today, I will most certainly be spilling some. Although, of course, that has expanded to just be the general language of the kids, so if you're a Gen Z, hi. Sorry for seeming like an old people, but, well, we've used to that for years, so... Back in my day, we just called it telling the truth. But yes, today I want to be talking about a few games that honestly have just disappointed me so very much because they are disrespectful to the player, they take forever to get good, and honestly, one of these is one of my favorite games of all time, so I think I have like a position to speak from for these sorts of things, but hopefully this sort of video can not only give you some of my very strong opinions, which I don't have a lot of, to be perfectly honest, and it can hopefully help you to not do this within your own games, because if it's something that I think of as an amateur game designer that like AAA game designers don't seem to pay attention to, or just completely ignore, which is part of the disrespect we'll get to in a second. Well, if you can see that, I mean, you've avoided one of the biggest traps of game design, and that is taking too long to get into something, or in other words, having too much exposition, which this video is about to get to, so yeah, if you enjoy this video, like the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more, but no pressure as always. I had to rush through that because I was about to make a video about exposition and take too long with exposition. But I'm going to start off by saying that if you enjoy any of the games that I'm going to mention today, two mainly, but possibly others, don't be mad at me because, well, I enjoy these games too, and I have a lot of respect for both of them, but it doesn't mean that I can't criticize them as well. Everybody's allowed to have their own opinions and all that. Especially because the first game that I'm going to talk about today, which, by the way, you don't need to know anything about these games to learn from them, but the first game that I'm going to talk about today is World of Warcraft, which, if you've been around on my channel for a while, you know I have played since 2005, and I've only been unsubscribed for probably a total of 1 year time. And, well, it's a $15 a month subscription fee, so you do the math. Clearly, I enjoy this game, but it doesn't mean that I can't criticize it. It doesn't mean that I haven't seen a lot of issues with it in general, especially when I've tried to get other friends into it, because especially as we've learned with the recent release of WoW Classic, the leveling system, which is the first thing that you will go through upon buying the game and upon subscribing to the game, has just become so archaic and so disrespectful to the player's time, to the point where the best way to level right now is honestly just to enjoy levels 1 through 60, because there are some ways to enjoy that still, or just put a podcast on for all 120 levels, and then know that the end game is very, very fun. Now, this to me is the epitome of disrespect for a player's time, because if you're going to tell someone that they have to play 20-some hours of your game just to get to the good part, that is absolutely ridiculous. And I think Blizzard realized this a lot recently with the implementation of kind of level scaling for the Classic world. So from levels 1 through 60, which is less than half the leveling experience because it does go up exponentially, but from levels 1 to 60, at least now, you can choose a zone, and even though it's so quick now because they've just said, okay, we're going to speed this up, so that'll solve the problem, well, it clearly didn't, hence this video, but they've at least implemented a way that through that level 1 through 60, you can choose a zone to level in. There are still a lot of limitations there, but the good news is that they're removing all of those limitations within the next expansion, and although it's still going to be very quick to level up, you will actually be able to finish a story and enjoy a segment in this game while leveling before you get to max level. But the biggest issue with this is the disrespect for a player's gameplay. It takes so long to get all of your abilities as a class within this game to the point where you can then customize those abilities that you are, for the most part, playing with a significantly gimped version of your character for the majority of the leveling experience, or at least a big portion of it. And that shows a lot of disrespect for the player's time and disrespect for the player's intelligence, because you're expecting that it's going to take them 20 levels to understand how to cast a Frostbolt and maybe sometimes run away and use Frost Nova, but considering how easy the game is at the time, you don't really need to do that. And that's very frustrating, because a lot of other games do this too. There are other RPGs I've played, specifically the Tales series, that I love, by the way. I have played almost every single one of those games, and finished at least 2 of them. They're 60-hour games, don't come for me, but they are very good games. It just takes far too many levels to actually get interesting abilities that you have to choose between, as opposed to just this ability uses mana to do more damage. And there is this exists across a lot of different genres, one of which I'll talk about in a second, but not giving the player access to abilities or to a system or to systems that the game requires to be fun fast enough for them to actually enjoy themselves is pretty much just telling the player, hey, I don't really care about your time, so feel free to spend the first 3 hours of this game bored, or feel free to spend the first few hours of this game, or in World of Warcraft's case, the first 20 hours of this game without all of your abilities, which the game is built around to be fun when using all of those abilities. So up until that point, for the most part, it's going to feel like they're just missing. And a lot of games do this very well, where they will introduce you to the majority of them and actually give you a system that's fun to play, and then add on top of that later on. But it's just something that, in my experience and in my opinion, it just feels disrespectful to the player's time. Another game that is so guilty of this to the point where it took me 5 tries to get past the first 3 hours of the game is Mass Effect. Now, again, at this point, I want to remind you that this is just my opinion, and it's not to say that I have no respect for Mass Effect as a series, because I really do. I understand how revolutionary it is in terms of the gameplay systems, but more importantly, in terms of the storytelling, and I see how it is very progressive in terms of social justice, which is great to see in a video game, especially from a AAA studio, and especially one that's so popular. But it doesn't mean that it's without its flaws, and this is one that literally stopped me from playing this game for a very, very long time. And that is the systems that it takes forever to introduce, and the systems that even when they're introduced, it takes a while to give you any sort of choice or intrigue within them, specifically the whole talent system within there. So in Mass Effect, you are slowly introduced to all of your options for combat over the course of the first 3 hours of the game. And by that point, you don't even have all of the options that you will have later on in the game, which is fine. It's okay to introduce things later on and give the players more choice as they progress to keep things interesting. But the issue is, up until that point, up until about that 3 hour mark, the systems are just boring. And I mean, again, this is opinion based, but after 3 or 4 tries to start with, I couldn't even unlock all of them because I was so bored. And I felt like, to me, the developers were just kind of saying, oh, just sit back, it's going to take a while to get used to this. But at the same time, it's disrespectful, sort of like when you're a dungeon master in a D&D campaign and you spend half the session talking or reading or monologuing about exposition about your world. It's kind of disrespectful and a little bit pretentious, and I don't like games like that. It feels awful, and it just makes me feel gross about the game in general. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it took me until the 5th try to actually get more than 4 hours into the game, but I don't think that that is something that you want to look at and try to replicate. If a player is not enjoying the game for the first 2 hours, well, obviously it could just be the player. And in this case, I will admit that maybe it is just me, but at the same time, it's not. I've talked to other people, I've talked to a lot of my close friends, and seen the same issue where they think it's such a great game, but then I mention this sort of expositional issue, and they're like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Well, I'm glad you forgot about it, because gosh knows I haven't, because I've gone through it 5 freaking times. But it's truly frustrating, and hopefully you can look at that and kind of see what not to do, so that we can then talk about what to do, because I've actually been playing through a really good example of how to not baby the player like this in a game called Secret of Mana, which you may have heard of. Now, obviously, Secret of Mana, like all of these other games I've talked about, is not without its flaws. It does have a little bit of an issue with the party system being part of the main combat of the game, and the combat not working super well without it, but at the same time, you get that party by the end of the second dungeon, which is, an hour into the game. That's not that bad. And the best part about this is even before that point, you are given all of these weapons which have their strengths, have their weaknesses, and can be used to complete certain areas and get through certain areas. For example, the swords being able to cut through grass at a very base level. But you're given all these weapons pretty early on, and you just kind of find them, and then you're left to experiment with them and find out what they do. Now, at the early part of the game, when you first start, they teach you how to use a sword, they teach you how to play, and they teach you about the recharging interesting combat system, which, in my opinion, by the way, is super, super satisfying. I don't understand how a system like that exists in such an old game, but oh boy, is it fun. But they introduce you to all of that very early, and then just kind of let you play with it and let you learn. And I think that that is a fantastic example of what to do when you're creating an RPG, or even creating a sort of platformer. When you are introduced to these aspects as a player, you get the hang of them pretty quickly. And I think it's okay to assume that anybody playing your game, for the most part, has played a video game before. And the best part of this is that not only does it show a level of respect for your player's intelligence, but it also makes it kind of fun for them to experiment. You're not telling them how to use the different weapons, or you're not telling them what enemies are particularly weak against certain weapons, like the ranged weapons in the game, or what enemies are very strong against certain weapons, like the werewolves, when you try to hit them with any sort of ranged weapon, but you are letting them find that out for themselves while giving them all the tools to do it and not making it impossible to do so. So all of those are aspects that are very important to look at when you're creating challenges to start with, because you don't just want to throw a bunch of abilities at your player and expect them to know how to use them. That's a terrible idea. In fact, even introducing a double jump without kind of showing the character with some very simple platforming how to use a double jump and kind of introducing them to something that might be basic for a lot of gamers out there but isn't for everyone, that is kind of using the first jump and waiting to use the second one to get the most distance, or using them both in sequence to get to higher positions. Sort of slowly introducing them to that is fine, but I mean over the course of minutes, not hours. When you have 2 or 3 abilities, you can introduce those very quickly, and a lot of games do this really well. I talk a lot about Mario 64 on this channel because I think it's a fantastic game, and because it has so many good examples of everything, but also because it's one of my favorites. But Super Mario 64 does this super well with all of the different jumps it gives you. It allows you to explore and find out how to use them, the triple jump, the backflip, the side jump, and it allows you to learn how to use these in order to get more stars using them, because a lot of stars require you to use them. For example, that sideways jump is actually required to get one of the stars in Big Boo's Haunt. But it introduces you to all of these by just letting you find them, by talking to a toad and he will tell you how to do it, or alternatively, just something that you accidentally do by playing around in the game. And I love that, because on top of these all being options and being very fun to use, they aren't actually required to finish the game. As far as I'm concerned, the only thing that's required to finish certain parts and to actually get through enough stars to get through all of the Bowsers is the wall jump, which is actually taught to you within one of the levels. And so they teach you the ones that are required, but give you all of these other options to use if you want to, and sort of challenge you in different ways. And I think that obviously Super Mario 64 has a ridiculous amount of content that isn't necessary to the end of the game, and for Dreams peoples like us, we're not going to have the time to make any sort of thing like that. But hopefully that can give you an idea of sort of the good ways to do it and the ways that are very frustrating as a player. But in general, with this video, all I want to do is to instill within the minds of the people that you need to have a level of respect for your players, because they are spending their time playing your game, and while obviously they should have respect for the designers and say, oh, you spent a lot of time making this, so you respect the game just for the time they spent making and writing for it, but at the same time, that respect does go both ways, and it's something that I think is important to think about when you're creating games, especially if you want people to actually enjoy your games and to, well, I mean, get to the good parts of your games quickly. But just like an essay, you want to make sure that if there are parts that you're thinking for a second, is this necessary? Is this something that I should include, like I do with my videos a lot, that maybe you think of removing it if it's not. Or if certain sections are feeling a little bit too expositional for you as a game designer, well, maybe they're going to feel that way for the player too. Because if you have created things like this before, if you've written stories, if you've played D&D, you know what it feels like to be sitting there while somebody monologues for like 2 hours and how awkward and weird that can be. But you know what, maybe that's just me. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Like I said, this is just my opinions. I mean, these are games that I wanted to talk about today because I felt fit the subject, but there may be other games that do this worse or do a really good job of not throwing the player into 4 hours of exposition. But feel free to leave those in the comments down below. For now, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to like the video and subscribe if you want to see more. But again, thank you so much for watching. I hope we didn't spill too much tea today, but most importantly, I hope you enjoyed this video. I will talk to you guys in the next one. But for now, goodbye.